Thanks for coming out, and I hope you'll take some food home for snacking later or afterwards. We have plenty tonight to share. My name is Pam Cressy. I'm the president of Historical Society, and this is the second lecture in the fall season of the 23-24 annual season. And next year we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Historical Society. Some people have said, well, Alexandria is so historic, why is the Historical Society only 50 years old? And I think that's a very good question to ask. I think in many ways people were just so enchanted by the architecture and by knowing that George Washington walked around here that a lot of other topics weren't really delved into. So I had the pleasure of knowing many of the founders of the Historical Society in 1974. I didn't meet them till 1977, but I appreciate all that they did. Tonight, our speaker is Abby Schreiber, and she's sitting right here. She'll be joining us in a minute to talk about the new perspectives on the old waterfront. And this means the really old waterfront that we don't even recognize today. This is the waterfront that was the Crescent Bay between what we now call Orinoco and Duke Street. You're limiting your talk to that area. And how the early founders of Alexandria, as well as all the people that labored under their efforts, envisioned Alexandria and were certainly a part of its development in its early decades. Just a note before I mention Abby's background. The waterfront was, to me, kind of an enigma when I started as city archaeologist, in that we had a lot of discussion about how much the Potomac had been dredged, and that underwater archaeology might not be in very good shape under there, even though many things had been established and lost over the years. But what we found is that under the very blocks that we walked on and parked cars on and people lived on were the places that held waterfront resources, from prehistoric, indigenous habitation and artifacts, all the way through the early parts of the 20th century and industrialization. In the 1980s, one of the torpedo factory buildings was torn down, which was a celebration. Citizens were so excited that this giant donut building came down, and from the Carlisle House you could actually look out and see the river. And everybody said, this is the way Alexandria is supposed to be. You should stand at the Carlisle House and see the river. And there was still, though, the torpedo factory buildings on the east side of Union Street that now have the Art Center and then the other office building. Those buildings stayed there. But when the donut came down, we, as the city archaeologists, were very interested because we thought that Carlisle could have his wharves could be there. And in fact, archaeological excavation revealed the very first time we had seen the early timbers and the cribbing, and we began to study this. And Dr. Stephen Shepard, one of the city archaeologists, also wrote on the topic and delivered several papers on this subject. We were not able to get back to that early waterfront as much as we wanted to because it was very dependent upon development. And again, we looked at an early wharf on Lee Street, we call the Lee Street site, by Lee and Queen, and saw how it was constructed and some of the stone that was on top. But oftentimes we were just, these blocks were already developed, and we weren't, like all the townhouses by Founders Park, we couldn't, that was gone. We could not do anything about looking at those blocks. So it's very exciting for me that Dr. Schreiber has been able to do this historical research so that we can find out more about these early wharves that in many cases I think are still under there, right? Fortunately. So using a few well-documented case studies, her talk will describe the processes, people, and plans for the infilling of Alexandria's historic waterfront. Her research has revealed rich detail about the roles of women and enslaved peoples and unfree workers in these important changes. Part of her studies documented the chain of title for all the properties between the waterfront and Lee Street, which was once called Water Street, right? So you can tell when that name was changed, right, from Water to Lee after what particular revolution or war, between Prince and Queen Streets. And among other uses, her work will help the office determine potential archaeological concerns as the city plans their flooding remediation. So once again, we have to think development, changes, better sanitation and sewage for bringing archaeology and historical research to light. Dr. Schreiber is an award-winning public historian who specializes in economic history and material culture in the early republic. She's worked on the role of merchants in early Baltimore through novel means of social network analysis. With the Homewood Museum in Baltimore, she's researched and developed an interpreted tour of the historic house that centers on the lives of enslaved people called Families of Homewood. Dr. Schreiber holds an MA in American Material Culture from the Winterthur program at the University of Delaware, and her PhD comes from the Ohio State University dealing with early U.S. history. So we're very fortunate to have Abby doing research in Alexandria, and I think you may be one of the few people in the world that can really compare Baltimore to Alexandria in these formative years when we have to say Alexandria finally lost out to Baltimore, even though it was neck and neck there for a while, I think. So thanks very much for coming.
I'm going to be talking about my research that I've been doing for the past 3 years. I'm winding down my job here at Alexandria, and they're moving forward with the project that they hired me to do research for. So I'll explain that a little bit before I get started. Some of you may have noticed that the waterfront floods from time to time. Thank you. That's been an ongoing problem since, Alexandria was founded. So they decided several years ago to work on a large infrastructure project to mitigate the flooding. And a big part of that project is going to be some underground storage tanks for runoff and floodwaters, and also building some pump houses probably. So before they could go forward with planning where and how they were going to build these things, they have to do the legally dictated archaeological research, and part of that is a documentary study, which is what I'm doing, finishing up right now. So after my study's finished, then archaeologists will start doing some surveys. I think they've already might have started in some areas. And then, in a couple of years, they'll be doing the installation of all this infrastructure. When I started my job, I was researching 4 blocks from Duke Street up to Queen. And then they added on 2 more blocks of Founders Park. So it extended me up to, Duke Street to Cameron, and then Founders Park got added on. So it's been an interesting and fun study to work on. And it's this, what I'm going to be talking about tonight is one part of the outcome of my work. I have written a report that will be available early in 2024, hundreds of pages of parcel by parcel documentation of who bought what and when, and what they may or may not have built on it, as far as we can tell based on documentary research. Another product that I'm creating is a story map, which is going to be available probably at the beginning of 2024 as well, which will have like a selected highlight of a few different stories that I kind of focus on, and that's something people can pull up on their phones, or you can look at it on your computer at home. And then I'm also have created a GIS database of all the deeds and some of the census records and some other documentation, so that staff or researchers can access my database. All they have to do is click on a parcel, and it will pull up all of the deed history of that parcel, which maybe doesn't sound that impressive, but if you've ever tried to do a chain of title for your house or for a house in Alexandria, you know that it involves, going to different land records offices, and some things are on microfilm and some things are available digitally now. And it can be pretty hard to make it through all of that. So that will be a resource that will hopefully live on as long as we are interested in pursuing that kind of stuff. So today I'm just going to sum up in 45 minutes all that work I've done. for you guys. This is just a basic outline of what I'm going to be talking about. The three wharves that I'm going to focus on: Glassford and Company, the Errol Wharf, and the Irwin Wharf, and how they were made and what's important about that. All right, so here we are in 1749. George Washington created this plan to show the numbered lots that would be sold at auction to investors. The early proprietors of Alexandria believed that the land surrounding the bay would eventually be valuable waterfront property. Most of the land was created by banking out. They removed dirt from the high bank, and then they used it to fill in the shallows by building bulkheads or cribbing to contain the fill. Until the Revolution, there were few advances into the Crescent Bay. Carlisle and Dalton built a wharf at the foot of Cameron Street, and there's archaeological evidence for a bulkhead about 30 feet away from the natural shore off of lot 69, which is down here. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Point Lumley. So siltation probably filled in a lot of the flats for them. I'm assuming that you all are familiar with this, but this is an indication of where the flats were. So the idea was, once you get out here, you're in the deep channel where a larger vessel could be sitting, and this would be it obviously was tidal, so it could be between a few feet and to 10 feet deep. So they would use flat bottom boats to carry things from ships that were landed in the channel, or they would use the points exclusively. So I'm going to play this visualization for you, and then, because you're going to be so amazed by it, I'm going to wait and talk about it afterward. So this is showing the extension of the shoreline according to documentary evidence. Each parcel that you see is a documented sale, gift, tax, or lien. The main takeaway here is that most of the banking out occurred after the Revolution. Some have theorized that there was a sort of common effort to extend past current Union Street after 1782 because the state designated that they were allowed to extend Union Street in 1782. I haven't found direct evidence of that. No one saying let's go boys, let's get this done. But all the landowners were, serving in civic roles. They were all people that had power and money. So it's pretty easy to imagine that they kind of applied that collective power, toward a common goal there. So by 1790, all of the study area extended east of Union Street. So that's what you're seeing in this visualization. I'm going to share a few examples of banking out at different areas of the waterfront to help us understand the circumstances of how this took place. One of my goals in the project was to pay close attention to the historical actors that we tend to overlook. So the workers who accomplish the physical labor of building, using and maintaining these structures, the women who owned and managed properties and businesses, and the people who did not come out on top when everything was said and done. Oh, I pressed the wrong button. So first off, we have Glassford and Company. John Glassford was a prominent and prosperous Scottish tobacco merchant who capitalized on the expanding monoculture of the Chesapeake region in the 18th century. And what monoculture would that be? Tobacco, there you go. Good job. He controlled a major portion of the Chesapeake trade, despite never having traveled to North America. He used agents or factors to expand a network of stores and warehouses, which you can see here were focused on the Potomac River. So this is going up along here. But also extended to other parts of the bay. Glassford was representative of the colonial mode of extracting profit from the colonies, a mode which used up land and labor and was vulnerable to swings in the tobacco market. So it's interesting that in 1765, Glassford and Company began operations in Alexandria, which was functioning as a tobacco port, but kind of had its sights set on the west. The town trustees and lot owners were slowly building a functional waterfront that would promote trade and create landings for larger vessels. So lots 31 and 32 So 31 I have on there, 32 is to the west of it. And since it's not on the waterfront, we're not going to talk about it. So they were previously owned by Gerard and Mary Alexander. Colonel Gerard Alexander owned Abingdon, which was a plantation north of Alexandria, and was a justice and burgess of Fairfax County. In a somewhat unusual move, he left his town lots and houses and the profit from them to his widow in lieu of a dower. So normally a widow would get a third interest in her husband's estate, which she would be able to have the advantage of using until her death. But this was a little bit different than that because it wasn't just for her lifetime. And it wasn't a third. He also gave Dick, an enslaved serving boy, and Bess, an enslaved house servant, to her for her lifetime. Unfortunately, we have no surviving evidence of what, if any, modifications he made to these lots, though by law he should have built at least one structure on each lot by 1752. John Glassford and Archibald Henderson purchased the two lots and all their associated houses, yards, gardens, and rights of way for £320 sterling in 1767. It's possible that Glassford and Co. Occupied these lots as tenants before their official purchase. The company, under the direction of agent Henry Riddle, built, quote, a large and commodious brick storehouse, and they also built a cooper shop, a stable, and fenced in part of the area, and began to build a wharf before they eventually sold it in 1776. City archaeologists found evidence of a bulkhead-type wharf that extended to approximately 200 feet east of Water Street, which we call Lee Street now. Measuring 20 feet wide, the wharf surface was partially covered with large flat stones. They found a top layer of fill with cultural materials such as glass, pottery, leather, man-made things, a sterile sediment layer, and then another fill layer with cultural materials. So their conclusion was that someone partially filled the wharf, work ceased for several years, tides, rains, floods kind of made that sterile layer of sediment, and then someone else completed the wharf after a number of years and then added the paving stones. Documentary evidence supports this conclusion, as Henderson noted in 1776 that a, quote, valuable improvement was under construction. Archaeologists could not determine with certainty how far into the river the wharf extended. However, they did not find remains of an eastern-facing bulkhead. So it likely extended beyond the 200 feet that was found. Its construction was atypical of other 18th to 19th century wharves in Alexandria because the bulkhead was constructed of planks rather than timbers or horizontal posts. They conclude that either the location of the wharf in the shallow, slow-moving bay called for a less significant construction technique, or this exposed section was part of a larger grid of groins meant to stabilize a large area of fill. They were not able to conclusively determine if there were additional sections to the north or south of this feature. So did Glassford and Company intend to fill the entire frontage of their lot, or were they extending a wharf further into the bay as their southern neighbors, Carlisle and Dalton, did beginning in 1759. So was it more like a narrow strip out into the river, or was it meant to be like a total extension of their wharf? We still don't know the answer to that. Alexander Henderson purchased the lots and under construction wharf in 1776. He was a Scottish immigrant who moved to Colchester, Virginia in 1756. He acted as an agent for Glassford and Company, but also served in public office and in the Virginia militia during the Revolution from 75 to 79. So it's unlikely that he, while active in the military, was making improvements on this wharf lot. He sold the lots to Alexandria merchant and banker William Herbert in 1778. Herbert then quickly sold the lots 31 and 32 to Thomas May, who was an ironmaster from Cecil County, Maryland. And that sale happened in February of 1778. So it's possible that Thomas May was actually the one who did that second layer of working on the wharf and finishing it. Thomas May had experience doing wharf building in Cecil County, Maryland. So he's a whole other interesting story, but there's really very little documentation about him here in Alexandria. On to my next wharf. So, Richard Errol. He was a merchant and landowner in Philadelphia. He and his wife, Christiana, had 5 children: David, Samuel, Elizabeth, Mary, and Catherine, or Kitty. In 1759, Errol offered his Pennsylvania real estate, including a 240-acre plantation, a sawmill with 2,500 acres of timber, and then in Philadelphia, 7 brick and 1 wood tenements and 2 bake ovens, all on Front Street, which is right in the heart of the merchant area of Philadelphia. So the family moved to Alexandria sometime between 1760 and 1762. They were among a wave of opportunity seekers who felt squeezed out of the more established ports and kind of saw a chance at economic opportunity here in Alexandria because it was kind of thought of as an emerging business area. Richard Errol purchased several city lots when he arrived in Alexandria, but did not buy lots 69 and 70, which would be down here at Point Lumley, until 1775. By that time, Errol's Tavern near the Market Square was a fixture of town life. Richard had married his second wife, Eleanor. I'm not sure when his first wife died and when he married his second wife, but sometime in there. And the children were grown. So Errol may have built a bulkhead retaining wall in the spring of 1775 north of the town warehouse. Remains of the wall were discovered by archaeologists during a 2017 survey related to a construction project for the Hotel Indigo. Piles angled toward the shore were driven into the riverbed and backed by courses of horizontal planks attached with wrought nails. Adjacent to the wall, a scuttled ship was the hull of a ship, and a buried barrel appeared to have served the same purpose, which was retaining the man-made shoreline. The location of the bulkhead and ship hull are about 30 to 35 feet from the mapped shoreline of 1749. That is a hard thing to estimate, though, because the mapping of that shoreline is not exact. So, roughly. The timber for the piles was dated with dendrochronology and was felled in the winter of 1774 to 1775, showing that this work was likely undertaken the following spring, or it could have been later on. Errol's plan to capitalize on his waterfront lot 69, however, was delayed by years of legal disputes with the town. Richard Errol took legal action to define the border between his lot 69 and the city-owned Point Lumley. So I know this is a little hard to read, but 69 is right here. And then if you see there's a tiny rectangle between B and C, that is the area that was under dispute. This off the edge kind of rectangle is the warehouse, the town warehouse. So Richard was saying he owned this area, and the town was saying, no, it's public land. So there's all these testimonies in the court documents about people saying, like, one person says, like, oh, I could definitely walk behind the warehouse on dry ground. And then someone else is like, no, you absolutely couldn't walk behind the warehouse on dry ground. So, but this is all happening like decades after the dispute. Or decades after they first built the warehouse. So, these were all like older gentlemen who were testifying. So he lost his first lawsuit against the city in 1780. He then leased Lot 69 to a tenant who we don't know their real name, but they went by Aminadab Seakwright for 20 years, beginning on March 1st, 1784. The city sued them again for improper possession, resulting in a forcible ejectment of the tenant. Years passed, and the first documented occupant of Errol's Wharf was Patrick McMahon in 1791. McMahon followed the art of building, repairing, and filling of wharves. But there's no evidence as to whether or not he built Errol's Wharf, though it seems unlikely. I'm pretty sure he was working in Baltimore before he came to Alexandria in 1791. So someone else probably built the wharf before he showed up, but it's possible. The boundary dispute extended for years while Richard Errol and his maturing children continued to live their lives. The Errol children made strategic marriage decisions that upheld the family's social status and reinforced their land holdings. The most dramatic example of this was the marriage of Elizabeth, whose extant sampler displayed her skill in education at age 10. Fancy sewing such as this was a common practice for elite girls and young women and was an important signifier of their discipline, talent, and wealth. Approximately 3 years later, at the age of 13, she was married to Cyrus Copper of Maryland. He was 10 years older than her and was also a business partner of her older brother, Samuel. He was a vendu master or an auctioneer in Alexandria. So Richard Errol's sons, David and Samuel, joined the revolutionary cause, with David rising to the rank of captain before his resignation in 1778. David and Samuel owned extensive real estate separate from their fathers and joined business partnerships outside of their immediate family. For example, William Hunter and David Errol purchased a lot in Alexandria together. Hunter then married into the Errol family, wedding Catherine or Kitty Errol in August of 1782. Errol's third daughter, Mary, married George Jenkins, and that one, I think he was in Maryland and didn't really hang around in Alexandria much, so they won't come up again. But they did all marry to kind of solidify their family status. The spouses stood to benefit from the elevated economic position these young women enjoyed due to their father's investments. So Cyrus Copper and William Hunter contributed financially and logistically to Richard Errol's construction campaign related to building out his wharf into the Potomac River. In return for their work, their father-in-law promised them that he would give them lots on the west side of Union Street that they could have after they finished building out the wharf. This map shows all the parcels that were owned either in whole or in part by Richard Errol and his sons and sons-in-law before 1790. It shows that as a family group, they controlled a significant amount of real estate in Alexandria. When Cyrus Copper died in 1785, Elizabeth Errol Copper acted as his executrix and then managed the real estate she owned on her own behalf. He was mid-construction on a large 3-story brick house on Union Street between Duke and Prince Streets. And for that one, I'm not sure if it was on the west side of Union or the east side of Union, but I think it was probably on the west. Elizabeth managed the completion of the structure and then offered it for rent in 1790 and 1793. The inheritance process for Richard Errol's 3 adult daughters was complex. His son David and 2 of his sons-in-law, Cyrus Copper and William Hunter, predeceased him. Richard Errol died in 1795 without a will, and then without having officially recorded which lots he was going to give to which of his sons and sons-in-law. So this became a problem. His son Samuel died soon after him. Richard Errol's personal property, including 3 enslaved adults and 1 child, were sold at auction to cover debts owed by his estate. Within months, his daughter Mary Jenkins and widow Eleanor Errol also died. This left 2 daughters and a few grandchildren to divide the estate, much of which occurred over several years and through many court cases. So it was not uncommon for women to own land in their own name in early Virginia. Traditional English law treated women as dependents, so their claim to land was usually through their husband or their father. But in colonial Virginia, where the death rate soared in the colonial period and it became extremely complicated to maintain that type of inheritance that they had practiced traditionally in England, we see a lot more women being declared femme sole, which means independent, legally independent. So these changes were written into law during and after the American Revolution, when women could more easily directly inherit real property. Irwin's Wharf is on the modern 100 blocks of South Union Street, which rests entirely on made land that was banked out from the original town lots of 51 and 56. So this lot and this triangular lot, but I'm going to be focusing on this one right there. Lot 51 fronted on the mud flats that extended nearly 450 feet to the shipping channel of the Potomac River. It included a high bank that traced the edge of the crescent-shaped flats. At the first offering of parcels in 1749, lots 51 and 52, so these two, it was very typical for them to buy the Waterfront lot and the one behind it. So that is pretty standard. Were purchased by Lawrence Washington, who was the elder half-brother of George Washington. Lawrence Washington was a town trustee until his death in 1752, and then lots 51 and 52 were not included in the trustees' list of vacant lots in June of 1754, suggesting that Lawrence Washington or his estate manager or executor built a suitable structure on the lot as required by deed. John Patterson then purchased lots 51 and 52 from Lawrence Washington's estate in 1760. So that was like 8 years of management by the estate executor. Patterson was a joiner who had completed extensive carpentry and joinery at Mount Vernon, adding a second floor to the original manor house in the summer and fall of 1758. He worked at Mount Vernon from 1757 to 1760 and supervised enslaved workers there. He made repairs to the Alexandria courthouse and employed indentured servants and apprentices. The business relationship between Patterson, George Washington, and John Carlisle, who procured the supplies for the courthouse construction project through his firm Carlisle and Dalton, may have facilitated this property transfer that occurred in 1760 when he bought these parcels. Patterson prepared a will in October of 1765 in anticipation of a trip to Europe. However, the document does not describe any structures on lots 51 or 52 beyond the boilerplate phrase messuages and tenements, which probably means a dwelling house and some smaller buildings that someone could have rented. Possibly a warehouse or other structures as well. But it doesn't give a detailed description, unfortunately. John Patterson died in 1768, and his widow, Susanna, sold lots 51 and 52 in 1778, so she managed it for about 10 years. Irish immigrants John Fitzgerald and Valentine Piers purchased lots 51 and 52 after being in business together and fighting in the American Revolution. Fitzgerald came to Alexandria in 1769, and by 1773, he was dining with George Washington. Piers was from Lisburn, Ireland, in 1756. He was born in Lisburn, Ireland in 1756 and first came to Alexandria in 1774. They both sympathized with and joined the revolutionary movement, and they ended up selling a cargo of Irish linens, which they donated to the residents of Boston in December of 1774. The profits they donated, sorry. Both served in the military and returned to Alexandria in 1778, purchasing these parcels. Fitzgerald married Jane Diggs, who was a member of a prominent Prince George County, Maryland family, and then Piers married Eleanor Orr of Loudoun County, Virginia. Both men were enslavers and exploited the labor of unfree people in their private and business affairs. Unlike other waterfront lots, which included a right to extend or bank out into the Potomac River, Lot 51 did not come with that right due to its eastern edge being on Water Street and not actually on the river. They would call it the courses of the river. In 1778, Fitzgerald and Piers petitioned the trustees to sell them the, quote, sunken ground to eastward of Water Street, opposite to lot number 51, and adjoining to King Street on the north side and to lot 56 on the south below the bank, and on the east side of Water Street, aforesaid unsold and unoccupied, formerly the property of Philip Alexander. Fitzgerald and Piers purchased these lots with the intention to bank them out, hoping that they could, profit from having a wharf there, but they had to seek the approval of the Common Council to do so, and they got that approval. In 1781, Fitzgerald and Piers divided their property west of Water Street, or Lee Street. After that, they began the work to bank out the tidal flats to the east. This project likely occurred in stages, with Fitzgerald and Piers leasing parcels on the east side of Water Street while they banked out the area on the east side of Union Street. So people who were occupying these parcels were probably living right next to a construction site. Fitzgerald's first tenant was Jenks Windsor & Co. They signed a lease in 1786 for the parcel on the southeast corner of King and Water. And then within 1 month, they had built a 2-story frame store and dwelling while they had other people were doing the labor. They paid for it. The two of the partners in this business lived in the upstairs rooms with an enslaved serving boy who handled their personal and domestic care. We also have an interesting piece of evidence from Olney Windsor, who would write letters back to his wife in Rhode Island. And he recorded witnessing the body of a black woman being on the wharf that was under construction in the fall of 1786. And her body laid there for several days, he says, before the wharf diggers, who were enslaved workers, were ordered to bury her inside the wharf. And he kind of wrote about how it was a sad reflection of society at that point that something like that could be allowed to happen. Unfortunately, I don't know what wharf he's exactly talking about. It could be this wharf, or it could be, in the neighborhood. Fitzgerald and Piers did not extend the wharf past Union Street until 1789, when a partition shows the extent of the ground that was added since 1781. So that's what you're seeing up here. The document shows how the land was divided between them and reserves a space for piers and docks. So over here, which is on the river side, this the description of this survey describes these as reserved for a pier, not that there's a pier already there. On the southeast corner of King and Union, Fitzgerald built 3 connected warehouses on stone foundations with brick walls and a shared loft or roof by 1796. Daniel McDougall, a sailmaker, moved to the loft of Colonel Fitzgerald's warehouse in February of 1798 and would stay there until at least 1804. In March of 1798, Samuel Brown sold peas by the bushel from his store on Fitzgerald's Wharf. So we start to see evidence that the wharf is finished by 1798. Fitzgerald also extended a 100 by 60 foot pier off the front of his wharf sometime after 1789, but I don't know exactly when. And of course, the corner warehouse that I'm talking about here is the one that is still standing today. That is where the Starbucks is. So some of you have probably been there. Fitzgerald was appointed collector of customs, and due to some fraud committed by his deputy, he owed the U.S. government about $57,000 when he died in 1799. That was a lot of money in that time period. I mean, that's a lot of money today, in my opinion, but would have been an obscene amount of money at that point. So the wharf and warehouses were used as security for his bond for that position. So they were put up for auction to raise money to pay for that debt. In the meantime, his estate paid Ephraim Mills to haul loads of earth to support the corner of the brick warehouse in 1800. So within just a few years of having built the warehouse, he's already, well, not him, Fitzgerald, but his executors are having to shore up the foundation already. So that tells you how much flooding is already happening and how much maintenance it's taking. When it sold at public auction in June of 1802, Fitzgerald's Wharf raised a winning bid of $14,750 by Alexandria merchants John Dunlap and Thomas Irwin. So, Irish immigrant Thomas Irwin operated as a merchant in Alexandria by 1791 when he and his brother sold imported goods and cordage from Harper's Wharf on Prince Street. Irwin purchased a lot on the west side of Union Street in 1794 that was practically across the street from this parcel. He and his wife, Hannah Janney, were members of the Alexandria Monthly Meeting. In other words, they were Quakers, and because of that, they did not own enslaved people. However, Irwin managed the time and labor of enslaved people routinely in his business affairs. Dunlap and Irwin partnered as merchants since 1793, importing general merchandise and grocery items such as textiles, coffee, and cotton. Dunlap purchased the parcel south of Irwin's on the west side of Union Street in July 1794 and built a brick warehouse there. Their joint accounts show some expenses related to its construction in 1794 to 1796, including buying posts and sinking them in the lot, plank and scaling labor, sand and brick for a footway on the lot, rails for the warehouse, white rope for the hoisting wheel, and nails, locks, and screws for the warehouse. So this is all for a warehouse on the west side of Union Street. In 1802, Dunlap and Irwin bought the wharf property practically across the street from their separately owned warehouses together. So Joseph Nevitt was a packet and steamboat operator, and he remembered the wharf being, quote, in ruins, the tide flowing over most of it in 1802. So you don't want the wharf looking like that if you want to use it, right? He described a small wharf with one pier, the water, quote, so deep as to enable the packets to lay with the bowsprit full up on King Street and resting on the logs, jutting over them into the street. The wharf was underwater when Dunlap and Irwin purchased it, but they filled it up, leaving the ground, quote, very rough and used for landing lumber. The map you're seeing here, or the survey rather, kind of shows you the evolution. Oh, there it is. The evolution of this parcel. So this is the original warehouse, the one that's still standing today. C and D were built in 1804, and then the wharf was extended out this far in 1844. This little yellow triangle, polygon down here was an extension of Janney's Wharf to the south, which happened in 1798. So the city paved King Street from Union to the head of the dock in 1804, so that would have been up here. And Dunlap and Irwin built these 2 3-story brick wings with hip roofs onto the east side of the existing warehouse. Depositions from a Supreme Court case to determine whether the wharf area was public or private reveal that Neil, Mooney, Abednego Adams, and John Ball, all bricklayers by trade, built the warehouses, and all of them used enslaved labor as part of their workforces, and other unfree people like indentured servants. Dunlap and Irwin extended the front of the wharf and built out a pier. Thomas Sanford, a sailmaker who occupied the space on the north side of King Street, testified that Thomas Irwin built out the wharf on piles and filled it with stone and earth. Many witnesses remarked on the loads of sand, stone, dirt, and earth that went toward filling holes as they opened on the surface of the wharf. John Howard, the occupant of the northeast warehouse, so D, claimed to have used hundreds of cartloads of dirt and stone to fill the wharf over a 4-year period. So they were sinking a lot of money into keeping this up out of the water. They used Bermuda ballast, which was ballast from the ships returning from the Caribbean, as fill here routinely. A 4-foot wide brick footpath extended from King Street along the east side of the warehouses to the 30-foot alley, so that would be along here. And then we know the alley, sometimes called Fitzgerald's Alley and sometimes called Dock Street, this right here, was paved with an unknown method by Fitzgerald and Swift in 1798. Dunlap and Irwin repaved the northern half of it probably in 1805 after they completed the new warehouses. Irwin or the warehouse occupant would lay down a temporary wooden gangway leading from the docks to the warehouse doors to keep barrels out of the mud. So that's kind of an interesting example of how they were used that we usually wouldn't see archaeological evidence for. Thomas Irwin was known to use a horsewhip to chase draymen and their carts off of his wharf. He said that the horses stamped holes in the surface and they drew flies, noise, and dust. Another witness testified that as a boy, he knew, quote, if I picked up a stone and threw it into the river, the old man, he's talking about Thomas Irwin, would come out and give me a kick. So he was very possessive of his wharf surface, which he did put a lot of work into it, so kind of justified, I guess. John Dunlap died in 1806, and documentation shows that the partners invested $7,400 repairing and extending the wharf and building the 2 warehouses. Irwin continued to profit from the rents, wharfages, and trade of the warehouses and pier until his death in 1827. His real and personal estates were evenly distributed among his heirs. However, the legal partition of the property did not take place until his youngest son, William H. Irwin, was at the age of majority, which at this time was 21. So it didn't happen until 1835. The warehouses were distributed to all of his children, male and female. Mary Irwin got this warehouse up here in the corner. I won't go over all the rest of them, but a couple of his children lived in Baltimore at that time, so there were people who were owning interest in this area that were corresponding from Baltimore. So the Irwin heirs allowed agents to do the collection of wharfage and dockage fees in the 1830s and 1840s. Major repairs to replace piers and decking occurred in 1852 after the Civil War. Mary Irwin filed a claim to the United States government to repay Alexandria taxes on the warehouse at number 5 South Union Street. This was due to its occupation by the US military and her inability to collect rents during that time, so she argued that she shouldn't have to pay the taxes since she didn't get the benefit. She actually won her request. She got $291 from the city. And then another major repair of the wharf took place in 1878. Quote, "The management of the wharf has become an intolerable nuisance," which was written by Francis K. Carey to his cousin Mary Irwin. This would be the niece of the original Mary Irwin that inherited the corner warehouse in August 1895. So the Irwin heirs contemplated their options to repair or sell their shared property after an 1893 high tide event seriously damaged the wharf. It picked up all the decking and moved it off of the piers and destroyed some of the piers. They hired the Alexandria Ferry Company was renting the wharf from them, but then after the damage, the ferry company stopped paying their rent because they argued that they couldn't use the wharf. Kind of makes sense. So the heirs were kind of going back and forth about this. Finally, they engaged a local contractor to fix the wharf. Something went wrong there, so they fired that guy and then hired a different guy. It was all very complicated. Eventually, they decided, let's cut our losses. So they sold it in 1905 after owning it for 103 years in this one family. So we have great documentation of the Irwin Wharf because they donated some of their family papers to Historic Alexandria, but also from a lot of these lawsuits that I've been referencing. We have some of that great, rich testimony. So this map from 1804 shows the significant physical changes that took place along the waterfront in the second half of the 18th century. Our main takeaways here are to remember that there is no long trajectory of economic success or continuum of, quote, positive change here. Profiting in this context, especially for those starting off with few resources, was very challenging. Assuming the best and luckiest business management, there were national and international influences that could completely level one's opportunities. A yellow fever outbreak could happen. That happened in 1803, where all the businesses in Alexandria shut down for months because it was deemed unsafe to be out and about, and it was. An international war or a changed legal statute that reshaped the marketplace. Every business venture or family I discussed today had at least one partner or member who went bankrupt or was forced to liquidate their real estate. In the Errol family, there's even one who ended up in debtor's prison. So nearly all the waterfront landowners were also enslavers, and many of them participated in the slave trade or the importation of unfree workers, such as indentured servants or convicts. Possession of people as chattel allowed them to secure financing to get cash when needed by selling people. As you saw in the Errol example, when the estate needed money to take care of some of their debt when Richard Errol died, they sold off enslaved people and kept the real estate. And then they also used enslaved people to pass on generational wealth through the bodies and labor of enslaved workers. Finally, we historically ignore and underreport the roles of women in business and financial affairs. So we saw lots of great examples of women owning land. They managed the rents and tenants, they owned businesses, and they too were enslavers. So I hope that these examples I've shared today will have you thinking about the waterfront, hopefully in some new ways, maybe some challenging ways, and also give you some interesting stories to share with your other history friends who are interested in history. So thank you for coming tonight. I appreciate your attention, and I'm happy to take questions if you have any. Go ahead.
Okay, this is very basic.
Okay.
It confuses me. What is the difference between a wharf and a pier and a dock?
This is a great question. Thank you for asking. So the question is, what's the difference between a wharf, a pier, and a dock? Interestingly, it depends on when you're talking, because in the historic period that we're looking at, like in the colonial era and the antebellum period, they seem to use the words a little bit differently than we do today. So if you say a dock today, what do you think of? Yes. So that, in this period, they would call a pier. The dock was the area of water where the ship would sit. So it's confusing. And yes, so a pier was a straight out, usually on piers with a floor of some kind. Sorry, the technical term escapes me right now. A wharf is usually a filled-in extension of the land. And it can be straight out and kind of narrow, but it can also be like the whole block would be a wharf. And they're usually bounded by bulkheads, like walls built as retaining walls, basically. So those are usually piles are driven into the floor of the river, and then they build up some kind of a wall, or there's several different ways they built the wharves, but that's one way.
Well, that helps because in reading about things on the waterfront in that era, it sounded like there were stores or warehouses
Yeah.
on wharves. And
Yes.
I couldn't quite figure it out.
So I'll just give you a visual to talk about this. Excuse me? Yes. So one of these cases actually made it to the Supreme Court, which is kind of wild. But the whole Supreme Court thing was about fence and the shanty. The shanty stood for, I think, around 8 months, and it became this huge deal. But we don't have to talk about that right now. So the wharf was this whole area. The whole block, basically, by this point, was a wharf. And they would say, this warehouse is on the wharf. They also would say, this area right here is the wharf. And that's another subject of legal dispute. Is this wharf area public or private land? Was one of the main, that's what the shanty problem was. The owners of this warehouse, speaking of bankruptcies, the descendant who inherited this warehouse went bankrupt. It got bought by someone not related to the Irwins. And then the Irwins built this wall, a fence, and a shanty. And then these guys sued the Irwins, saying, you're restricting public access to the wharf. And the Irwins said, it's our wharf. We can do what we want. And that's why we have all the testimony of like who was filling the wharf, what was it like, who was responsible for it, who was paying for it, because they're trying to establish, we have always paid for this privately. If this is a public infrastructure, then the public should be paying for it, right? So that was the subject of eventually the shanty was removed. Actually, it was removed before the court case happened, but the court found in the Irwins' favor, I think, in this case. Does that shed some light? It is confusing because at some point the language changes, right? Like they do start saying docks and they're talking about piers, and then sometimes people will say wharf when they mean pier. That can get tricky. Yeah. So we have to use a little bit of discrimination when we're looking at the sources that we have, because they can't always be taken literally. But knowing what the word should have meant at that time helps a little bit. Go ahead.
I'm surprised I haven't heard of the Arrow family.
Uh-huh.
In real estate. I wonder if there's any, if people know any evidence of their names still existing, like on a street or anything like that. I never come across that, and I didn't realize how much real estate they own.
I don't know about if their name is on anything public now. But part of the reason that they don't sort of live in the top echelon of our historic, rememberings is that they all died in the 1790s, and then the one son, who was Richard Errol, was in debtor's prison for a little while, so he ended up selling his interests. And then the people who, I can go on and on about this stuff, sorry. The people who inherited the land then were grandchildren of Richard Errol, and they were married to men who had other last names. So the parcels, when we first see them coming out east of Union Street, and we have documented transfers of them, sales, they're not in the Errol name anymore. They're other family names. So that's part of it. I mentioned people having good luck or bad luck, and that's just part of it, Oh, is there? Oh, okay. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Also about Errol, you said that parcel 69 was a tenant, and that we don't know the tenant
So the pseudonym, again, it's a court case. They use a pseudonym, Aminadab Seekwright, which was a pseudonym that was used, not, I wouldn't say like routinely, but it comes up in other court cases. Like if you, yeah, sort of like that. So the question is, why would someone use a pseudonym in a case like that? And I think part of it was just to like protect their personal reputation, because the people who served on the juries were all of the important people in town, like all the people who had the capital, who had the land. And so keeping their name out of the thing when they didn't really have any, they didn't have anything to win by being, involved there, was probably advised. No, it's just a pseudonym that was well, I don't know how popular it was, but I didn't do an extensive study of all the pseudonyms, but it is a known pseudonym that was used in legal proceedings. Go ahead.
Can you shed any light on the old military fortification down there at the end of the
This is my study area. So you'll have to talk to someone else about that, sorry. 1804.
What's the name of that?
It's from the public land records. So there's two versions of it. One is like this and looks nice. The other one is a very, very bad rendering, so.
Well, I know that when I looked into this a number of years ago, the fortification was never constructed. It appears on maps, but there's, including the open map, but I know the city kept asking for a federal court. And finally a contract was let, I believe, but it was one of these federal projects, didn't quite get finished, and the British came up anyhow to Alexandria. And I think the feds also had taken all the guns from here, except the ones that didn't work, if I remember the story. And so Alexandria was the best.
There's documentation about Thomas Jefferson's building time.
Was not constructed.
When you were talking about lots 51, 52, the Lawrence Washington,
Uh-huh.
and the people bought them, and then by 65, you said something in the will, you said there was boilerplate language. What were the two, what were the two words?
Messwages and tenements. Messwages is a very weird word. It's like almost spelled like massages. MESSUAGES. Messwages. I had to practice that last week. Yeah, it just refers to a dwelling house. It's like the legal term for a dwelling house in this period. Yeah, it really disappears after a while. I couldn't say off the top of my head if it's the revolution that really kills it off, that word, or if it's just like pretty much gone by the 1770s anyway. But definitely don't see it after the revolution that I can remember. But it's like later after the revolution, they just say this house and lot. Yeah.
Just curious, you said that you started this research as for the city in relation to their water mitigation
Mm-hmm.
plans. Are you aware of anything that you found in your research that may or may not be impacting the city's plans for water mitigation?
So part of the purpose of my research is to find those areas that would be more sensitive from a cultural resource perspective. The people who make the decisions about which ones those are is not me. So I know that there's some areas where I don't see a lot of built, there's not a lot of structures there. There's even one area where I don't think there's even a wharf there until the 20th century. And so those areas may be more interesting to them, but the cultural resources isn't the only thing deciding where they put stuff. And, that is all about like engineering and technical stuff that is very much not my realm. So yes, this does have some impact on those decisions, and that's something that the design team like takes into account early on so that they can kind of prioritize certain areas, but there's lots of other things that they're taking into account as well. And I wish I could tell you what the public input part of it is at this point, but I don't have a good handle on that because I don't keep up with that stuff. But I know that they do engage with the public about those kinds of decisions, so that's something you could maybe research on your own. I don't have a good source for you, sorry. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Off the top of your head,
Sure.
do you have any little interesting fact about Samuel?
Oh, so he was, off the top of my head, he was in the Revolution. I wrote about him some in my report. I don't remember all of the details of his biography. There's just so many people in this report. It's really hard to keep it all at hand. But there is some more known about him than what I talked about tonight. And
He owned the land where I grew up.
oh, really?
Yeah, I noticed on,
Yeah.
yeah.
So he probably only owned land from like the 1770s into the 1790s when he died. So he had a relatively short period of active ownership and then was interrupted by the Revolution. I think a lot of the activity he did was actually after the Revolution, so it would have been a pretty short time period. But once my report's out, you can search through it and find anything about. There's also a really interesting resource. There's a book published called Town Lots, where you can look up all of the is it pre-1800, pre-1780? I forget. Land transfers that happened in the original, and actually I think they expanded, Alexandria. So you can look up his name in the index and find all lots that he owned part of. Yeah, it's like a 8.5 by 11 size book. It has a blue cover. Yeah, the author's name is Ring and Pippinger. I'm sure they have it in special collections. Excuse me. Go ahead.
What's your next project?
Great question. I don't know. Currently, I'm hoping to get an extension on my contract to help be a liaison to the design team to help them like bring my research into the project. But I haven't heard on that what's going on. So TikTok, my clock runs out on December 15th. Yes, so they brought me in as a temporary contracted employee. Originally, it was a 2-year contract, but when they added the extra 2 blocks to the study, they extended my contract some more months, some more years, I guess. Also because of COVID, because at the beginning of my contract, everything was shut down for COVID, and I couldn't get into any archives to get deeds. So once I finally got access to deeds, then we really started cooking. But before then, it was very, what other books can I read about this topic? Go ahead. So the city has a waterfront interpretive plan that was made about 10 or 11 years ago. And in that plan, they made a lot of suggestions for how the city can have this unified interpretation of the waterfront, not just the study area, but all the waterfront of Alexandria. Another idea for extending my contract is to revisit that plan and suggest more specific interpretive elements to adapt, especially in the study area, because they're very general. And we have changed a lot in the last 11 years. There's new development that's happened. There's new historical interpretation that we're doing. The city is very dedicated to diversity and inclusion in all of our functions. And so that was not part of the earlier waterfront interpretive plan. I mean, obviously they were like paying attention to people who weren't white, but like revisiting it would put even more emphasis on that to try to give a well-rounded and complete picture of who was operating in the waterfront and when and why. Yeah. I found a job listing and applied for it, and then, of course, they picked me. So the city normally, when development happens in the city, normally the process involves a study like this. Usually it's a smaller area, like a block or a parcel. And so the developer usually hires a historian and an archaeologist to do this research and archaeological work. But because this is a city infrastructure project, and they knew at the beginning they expected it to be 4 blocks, they wanted to have someone in-house to do it instead of having it contracted out to someone who worked for someone else, so that they could have more control over the process, but also over the product. So I mentioned that database that I made in GIS. Typically, when the city engages contractors that work for outside companies, they aren't guaranteed to get all the work products. They aren't guaranteed to get all the GIS data that they create. And they really wanted to have this be a preservation tool so that, like I said, they can just click on a parcel and the whole deed history comes up along with some of the census records that are associated with it. There's another thing in there, but it just makes it like anybody in the archaeology department can like open it up immediately and get all that information that I've been searching for years. So yeah, it's all because of that. Oh, I don't think so. I think archaeologists have been using GIS for a long time. Yeah, it's a technological tool for sure. For historians, we don't tend to use GIS all that much. I did use GIS in my dissertation research, which probably made me an attractive candidate for this job because I'd already learned how to do GIS. So my colleague Ben didn't have to teach me how to do it. But historians use GIS too sometimes. Not as often as archaeologists, though. Yeah. Oh, one more question, sorry.
Why did the city just pick that small portion to study and not Spain?
So it's related to the flood mitigation project.
That's where the holding tanks and
Yes. So originally they knew, is that enough blocks? Hold on, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No. So originally they knew they had this 4-block area that they were going to use for this project. And then after, I don't want to go into a lot of details about the city's infrastructure project, but I will if you guys want me to talk about it. I'm sorry. The way they're doing it is like they design part of it and then they like kind of go back to the drawing board. I don't know. This is how I understand it. Maybe I'm wrong. And then they kind of say like, well, if we do it this way, it's not going to work because of cost or whatever. So then they go back and try something else. And then they get bids for a different idea. And so they eventually added on the Founders Park blocks because they started thinking Founders Park would be a good place to put some of the stuff. I'm going to not comment on that part of it. I am just a historian, nothing else. Any other questions? Thank you.
That was great. Thanks for coming out tonight. No more lectures till March. We take a sabbatical through winter, and we will start the 4th Wednesday of March again. If you're not getting our newsletter, let me know, and we'll get it to you. So thanks very much, and I think you'll all be thinking that you're walking on the water when you're on Union and Water Street, right? Thank you. Night-night.